Hello, time to start a new video. Now, today we shall be talking about two things because I don't know if you know this, probably not, but I'm going to visit a college soon, the college I'm planning on going to next year, and so, as a result, I won't be here for a few days. So I'm going to film two today and one tomorrow, at least that's the plan, so I can focus purely on experiencing what my college will be. Today's video will be on democracy, and by extension, suffrage. Now, for those who don't know, democracy comes from demokrati. I'm not going to get it exactly, but I'll look it up just to make sure. I was off. Good job, me. And it's demos and kratos. So, demos, kratos. Kratos meaning rule of, or just rule, and then demos meaning the people. So a democracy means rule of the people. Now, how this is interpreted in the modern sense, rule of the interpretations apparently, is that people get suffrage, meaning voting rights, and through suffrage, policy is enacted. So, policy is voted on by the people. If no, it fails. If yes, it passes. This is different from a republic because for a republic, suffrage has a notable hoop. Or instead of voting directly on policy, they vote for representatives, who then decide on policy, even deciding what policies go to the floor, though you can petition, especially in modern democracies, republics. In modern republics, you're often given the right to petition, and so then they vote, and the yes and no goes through. With presidents, there is the veto, but that is not a requirement of a republic or a democracy. It's just something that tends to happen when you have an executive. It comes all the way from Rome, where it was a way to basically have an extreme power, just in case the people got it wrong. Because, little known fact, people are stupid, especially en masse. Oftentimes, the people will think something sounds good and not consider that maybe it isn't. As a result, people have been known to make very, very stupid decisions. For example, the Salem witch trials were entirely a popular mistake. The people panicked and worried about witches. They thought the best course of action would be to try all the women that were suspected of being witches and killing them by whatever means necessary. Usually they were hung, sometimes they were executed in other ways. They weren't burned to death, that was for Europe. And one dude straight up got crushed underneath two boards. I actually, in school, read the whole thing made about that. It was a little play. I believe it was called The Cauldron. Nice play. I played the dude that got crushed. Giles Corey. It was fun. You know, much the getting crushed part, but thankfully they didn't reenact it. So, here's the thing with democracy. It's not a good system in its pure form. Pure democracy is mob rule. It is the rule of the majority. Now, in republics, there is some obfuscation here. As many people complain about things like, for example, borders and how land doesn't vote, people do, that obfuscation that republics do, whether it be through stuff like the U.S. Electoral College or the fact that they draw districts for who gets to represent and thus group people together, for all the flaws that does, it does result in the potential for the majority to be overridden, which on occasion is necessary. For example, if the majority wanted to go to war with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which, let's face it, during that period a lot of people were itching for a fight, what do you think would happen then? Nuclear annihilation. Fact is, people aren't always the best at making decisions. This is especially seen in the United States because, for us, interacting with the world is often an option, not a requirement. For example, in Europe, for a lot of their history, because of how many countries were maneuvering and making plays, they basically had to be on hand, constantly making alliances and preparing for a new war. Because if they slipped up once, especially during colonial times, one of their neighbors was going to invade and take their stuff. The United States, since its independence and largely beyond that, especially after it had its second industrial revolution, was largely able to stay out of things because, one, it was an ocean away, two, its neighbors were so weak, what play could they make? Let's face it, Mexico was so busy playing itself that it didn't have the time to play others. And then there was the simple fact that the only colonies that were there, like Britain's colonies in the Americas, were either too small or too sparsely populated to really do much. This allowed the U.S. to essentially stick it out for most of its history. The United States never had to actively intervene except for the World Wars. Now, during the Cold War, it did because it became a lot more wary of foreign intervention. But even then, the United States could have just said, nope, we're good, backed out of international affairs, let Europe follow the commies, and just hold up with Canada and the rest of the Americas. We fully could have done that. In fact, our people really were pacifistic for a lot of our history in regards to that. Actually, I shouldn't say pacifistic. We weren't pacifists, rather we were isolationists. We'd rather the world do their own thing, we're not involved, let us just be our own little autonomous thing. The issue is, foreign affairs don't work like that, and we couldn't do that without severely limiting our power. As a result, we eventually switched up, and now we're fairly interventionist in terms of foreign incidents. But the fact is, the people are known for making such isolationist calls. They're also known for making a lot of foolish decisions. For example, throughout World War II, as much as many people would say, oh, the Nazis were so evil, we should have just gone in and crushed them, there wasn't a lot of public support for that for a long time, even in Europe. Because in Europe, and to a lesser extent the United States, there was a very real lingering effect of World War I. People were traumatized, people had lost family, people were just tired, just done with the whole thing, and just wanted to recover. It's why you see so much appeasement going on early on, because what Britain wanted to do, and to a lesser extent France, was hope that over time they could prepare for a theoretical war while still maintaining public support, because they were both representative governments, meaning their people didn't want war, so they were hamstringing the representatives, because they were very much willing to vote them out at the single opportunity that they showed any level of interest in just blitzing the Germans. The U.S. was slightly less dragged down because of World War I, and was more in a situation of just, well, we're struggling with the Depression, we're trying to fix everything, let Europe do the Europe things, and we retreated back to isolation while we were hoping to crank out our own problems first. Never mind the fact that, honestly, a war would have probably solved the Depression a whole lot quicker. Because, if you don't know this, the demand created by war for products is a very good way to get people jobs, because a lot of businesses open up to supply the war machine. Those businesses produce jobs, people get paid, so they buy more things, and thus demand skyrockets. Now, the transition from a war to a peaceful economy is certainly a bumpy one. Just ask the U.S. shortly after World War II. But it would have probably solved the Depression. But people weren't thinking about that. They were just like, we got our own problems to deal with. Let Europe do its European nonsense, and we'll stick to ourselves. Which lasted all the way until the Nazis took over France, in which case, well, we still panicked, but we were like, I'm sure it'll be fine. The others will solve it somehow. It was only in December 1941 that we fully committed to the war as a populace. Now, because we were republics at that time, we still had people making moves beyond that. For example, FDR, with his Lend-Lease program and later Destroyers for Bases, was trying to help crush the Nazis. However, the people weren't really behind him, so he was basically having to stretch every legal loophole he could to help the Allies against the Nazis while simultaneously making sure that the people didn't vote him out of office. He didn't really need to do that because the people already basically lulled into a sense of security with his New Deal programs, but he still had some level of, shall I say, ricketiness to his position. Since if he didn't succeed in getting rid of the Depression, well, he was getting out of office and no one would trust his New Deal again. And that's the thing. Democracy is not inherently good. In fact, I would argue it's not a good system to rule under. There are only two good systems that I can really think of. Republicanism, rule of representatives, and constitutional monarchism, where the people's liberties are guaranteed by a monarch and their constitution, but the monarch still can rule with foreign affairs. Now, it's worth noting, this shares a lot of crossover with the idea of the Enlightenment and basically enlightened absolutism and just enlightened philosophy in general. However, the whole point of the Constitution is to avoid the problems that enlightened absolutism can become should despotism take over. For example, Catherine the Great did a lot of good things with her absolute power, but she also set up Russia to be very autocratic and very inefficient for a long time. It's also worth noting, a big problem is compromise in democracy. Now that may sound weird, especially in the modern day where a lot of people are talking about compromise, that's what we need. But you gotta remember, compromise is not always the best position. Between 2 points, the middle is not always the best spot. Sometimes you have to pick one side. Sometimes you have to pick the other. And sometimes, yes, the middle is the best choice, but that's not always the case. For example, slavery. The 3/5 compromise, a rather infamous one in the United States, was a compromise based on slavery. It was that midpoint. However, was that the right decision? No. What we should have done is picked a side and said, hey, slavery is bad, we should get rid of it. Because our whole thing is liberty and justice for all, so we should have liberty and justice for all. But it was the fact that we let people decide this without a care for natural rights because we were worried about the South splitting off. It was a compromise made based on the assumption of the people rising up to stop what would happen if slavery was banned, because the South was a very important part of the U.S. Not because of slavery, but rather because in a time of desperate situations where everyone's arguing over what the new state should look like, in that very tumultuous time, you really can't afford to have anyone outside of the stated plan. Because if people are going their own way and doing their own thing, well, you end up getting a lot of internal clashing, especially at a very tumultuous time. So the hope was, get everyone on the same page, compromise so that everyone gets something. We don't walk away with everything, but we each walk away with our own thing. And eventually, down the road, we can address this and solve it. But you really can't do that with stuff like slavery. It's gotta go. It just has to. It is a violation of natural rights. And so, it must be removed from any society or situation. As a result, you do sometimes have to basically say, screw the people, screw their opinions, what's right is right, what's moral is moral, and we gotta do it. Sometimes the government just has to do that, sometimes you on your own have to do that. If someone says 50% of the people want this policy, but I understand it to be ineffective and only hurting people, then that is a policy I cannot stand by. I don't care if 90% of the population wants it. If it hurts the people, I will not support it. Even if the people are asking for their own pain, I don't care. If it's not in the interest of the people, to my knowledge, then I will not support it. That's just what you have to do sometimes. There are sometimes you just have to say, screw the will of the people, screw all their opinions, what's right is right, and we will enforce what is right. For example, you wouldn't say that we should keep segregation going, right? But that was a very real moderate policy during the 60s. For a lot of moderates, that was the state to be. Let segregation exist, but, let the marches go on, let those civil rights leaders do their own thing. Do it locally. Shut down a few buses that are segregated, some mixed schools here, some mixed baths there. Just slowly let things come to a head. When Jim Crow, let's face it, violates people's rights of association and should have been abolished years upon years ago. Frankly, I have my own issues with civil rights, mainly the fact that it doesn't function as true rights, but regardless, I think we can all agree that Jim Crow was a mistake and one that should have been burned at the start of the 60s, 1860s that is. But regardless, it happened, and what we see constantly is the people are known for making bad calls. That's just a fact. People, being people, don't always know what's right. And when they get into a mass, they act foolishly because they attempt to essentially herd around their bad opinions and reinforce them through their own lenses and self-affirmations. Is that a good thing? No, but it's human nature. People are naturally social creatures, and we have a built-in herd mentality. And so, even if it's a bad call, even if it's basically the equivalent of going off a cliff, we still tend to stick together on those bad decisions. For example, if you were to hear someone say, alright, we should enact a policy where every person gets $10 taken out of their bank account and given to a random poor person. Would most people support that? Not on their own if they were just asked. Most would not support it. But if a bunch of people start shouting, we should do that, we should do that, well then that's what people are going to do. I believe there was an experiment, I'm not going to name it because I'm forgetful and I forgot, but what they did was they had people in a room waiting to be called on. They noticed people would stand up when they were about to be called on, and so it became instinct. Even if they weren't the one being called on, they would stand up too. People are, animals. They behave as any social species would. As a result, many follow the herd, and it becomes a very real problem when you try to have the people rule. Now, do I believe that suffrage should be limited beyond those who can fight in the military? No. I believe that if you are eligible to fight in the military, you should have a ballot, especially because if that is the line for when someone's able to have their gray matter splattered against a wall, then that is the line where they should be able to speak up and say what they believe. Especially because any one of those people could theoretically become an assassin. Remember, if you want to get a gun, whether it be legal or not, there is a way to do it. And that does mean that people can be killed if you so desire. Now, is it a good thing? No, not necessarily, but it is a thing that exists so long as firearms exist on this planet. And that means, naturally, every single person who is of age is a potential threat to everyone else. And the best way to ensure that that threat is reminded and it cooled is to let them have a vote. Because if they're able to vote, then they can just say, well, I didn't get what I want, but I'll just wait next year, on the next election cycle. It allows them to stall rather than saying, alright, I can't get what I want, and I can't vote for what I want, so I'll just take drastic action. That's not really a good thing. At least when it's muddled in the legality of a vote, it makes people far, far more likely to behave and act in a peaceful manner. Overall, to summarize, the rule of the people is not a good thing. Now, do I support some policies that help the rule of the people come to be? For example, the abolishment of the Electoral College. Yes, as a matter of fact, despite me being notably conservative, I do support the replacement of the Electoral College with a ranked choice voting system. Just my personal preference. Not everyone believes that, but I do. Mostly because of the whole assassination thing I mentioned earlier. It's a good way to placate the people. But, regardless, whether you're exactly in my position or you have differing views, the fact is, the people are not always trustworthy with power. So sometimes you do have to say, I don't care what the people think, this is right, this is what should go forwards. But, that'll be all for this video. Have a good one. Try not to invade the French. Actually, maybe do. And have a good day. Goodbye.